Yeah. Cool. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our um, week 9 session on Black Reconstruction. Week 9, always an exciting week in Black Reconstruction because we're talking about South Carolina. For people that don't know why I'm excited to talk about South Carolina, hopefully by the end of the session, it'll be clear. It's the first chapter on the state-by-state level that Du Bois offers, and there's a reason that he does it so. So as usual, though, we'll start with a bit of a recap for folks that weren't here last week. We kind of sped through a couple of incredibly long chapters covering 150 pages, which roughly covered the Andrew Johnson years, or at the very least, the Andrew Johnson years prior to the real kicking in of radical Reconstruction in and around 1867-8 in particular. And we read the chapter that Du Bois titles The Transubstantiation of a Poor White, about Andrew Johnson himself, the poor white in question, who, as Du Bois put it, embodied all of the contradictions of the poor white and poor white consciousness, particularly in the US South. And specifically, Du Bois is diagnosing in Andrew Johnson, the president that accidentally, unexpectedly inherits the presidency after Lincoln is assassinated, as as someone who came to power and had derived all of his identity through, from a fanatical hatred of the rich planter class in the South, but that hatred for Du Bois concealed a secret admiration, right? Secretly wanting to be that, secretly wanting to be wealthy, wanting to be rich. And as a result of that, all it took was a little bit of flattery from the planter in literally the months and weeks after Lincoln's assassination. And Johnson begins to soften on the need to disenfranchise the planter class, break up the plantations, and begins to turn backward, as Du Bois describes it. He, in this summary that Du Bois offers, that was the tragedy of American prejudice made flesh. And that's why he calls it transubstantiation, right? This is the Catholic framing of the body of Christ and the transformation on a fundamental level. But he also says, if you remember, that Johnson forced the country to choose between Reconstruction and real freedom, and turning back toward the past, right? And it was a contradictory contribution that Johnson was making, because the choice didn't go the way Johnson wanted, right? He provoked a situation, provoked a constitutional crisis by pushing back on the more radical demands. And every time he did that, he made them more radical, right? It sort of drives home the idea that only much more radical change will suffice, right? This happens all the time. This happened very similarly in the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, where Chavez comes to power and he's kind of like a radical progressive centrist. And then, he isn't really, but he's sort of playing that role. And then the aggression from the right is just unrelenting. And so this clash and this polarization, this dynamic of polarization, allows for a much more radical outcome to develop. And something very similar happens here. The choice that Johnson forces is this piece that Du Bois refers to in the next chapter, chapter 9, as the price of the disaster of war. The price of the disaster of war was this period of dictatorship, right? And ultimately, Black suffrage, right? Ultimately, the radical path out of this contradiction. And for Du Bois, again, and we'll come back to this in this chapter because it's very central, dictatorship means transition, right? We aren't taught to understand the category of dictatorship very well, but the first step to understanding that for Du Bois is to understand that Reconstruction was a dictatorship, right? And not just Reconstruction, right? School desegregation in the 1960s was military force entering the school, right? Forcing the doors open, forcing white racist Southerners to accept equality and accept democracy on a certain level. But again, the fundamental question for Du Bois is that this dictatorship did not last long enough. It was ultimately underwritten by Northern capitalists, which was the contradiction that undermined it while making it possible, that allowed for Reconstruction to go so far, and then when it got too radical, to be, sort of withdrawn, and to have the troops withdrawn, the rug pulled out from under the process. And of course, just very concretely speaking, the end of Reconstruction is marked by the 1876 Compromise, in which a Republican is given the presidency in a contested election. But the price of that presidency and the price of that compromise is the withdrawal of the troops, right? The withdrawal of the troops means a vacuum of force, that vacuum is filled by the Klan and white terrorism, and Reconstruction is dismantled. Right? We'll talk more about why and how in these sort of state level chapters. Now we're diving into a series of chapters that document on a state-by-state level what Reconstruction entailed, what we could call the kind of micro-dialectics of how Reconstruction played out in each state, and then kind of groups of states. Most of these chapters tend to be ignored, but they each have certain insights that we can really draw upon and glean from them, even if, especially next week, it's going to be moving through them very, very quickly. We're going to move through a group of chapters that do a lot of repetitive work that Du Bois is doing throughout the book, but we're going to be pulling out some of the key elements. But it's important for us to understand, first of all, that he arranges these chapters in a certain way. And very roughly, he arranges them from most radical to least radical, beginning with South Carolina. And if you look at the table of contents, you can see that it goes South Carolina, then it goes Mississippi and Louisiana, then Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, then what he calls border and frontier, which is a whole range of states, actually a complicated array of states. And in each of these chapters, Du Bois zooms in onto the state level, and when he does so, that provides him an opportunity to do exactly what we talk about all the time at Abolition School, which is to engage in material analysis, materialist analysis, to look at material reality, think about how it's arranged, what forces are at play, what classes, what groups, what geography looks like on the state level. I mean, when we say that the chapters move from most to least radical, this has everything to do with his materialist analysis, and specifically to do with his starting point, which you'll notice in each chapter or each section of a chapter when he starts to talk about a state. He begins with who lives there, right? Very basic demographic questions. And then what constellation of power are we then able to see and understand on the basis of this demographic arrangement? And then what is the structure of production? What is the geography? What is the level of education of these different groups and the organization of these populations, right? All of which provides for a kind of nuanced geography and territorial kind of mapping in each state. But you'll see again, repeated questions that Du Bois raises. Is there a Black majority? Does that Black majority gain power, and in what way? How did that power fare? And ultimately, what undermines that power? If there's a significant Black minority, questions like how does that Black minority interact with the poor white majority or minority? And how do the white planters manipulate both of those groups in these other states? And finally, how did Reconstruction fare in states where the Black population is very small compared to a far larger white and poor white population? And so when we begin with a chapter that's widely read on South Carolina, we're beginning with the state that Du Bois put first because it was the state with the largest Black majority, first and foremost. And it was the only state in which that majority, in terms of population, translated into majority control on a political level, right? South Carolina was where Black people had power during Reconstruction. And that's the only state where you can really, truly say that. And even then, of course, we have questions like, what did it mean to have power? But we're talking about state legislature, constitutional convention level power. In other states, as we'll see again, foregrounding next week, Black majorities that do not gain power, that do not achieve that basic level of power, and as a result, have less impact on how Reconstruction plays out. And we can see this right from the beginning, again, from our chapter summary, in which Du Bois is very clear, how in the years of 1868 to 1876, in a state where Blacks outnumbered whites, the will of the mass of Black labor, modified by their own and other leaders and dimmed by ignorance, inexperience, and uncertainty, dictated the form and methods of government, right? So the mass of Black labor, in its majority, dictated the form and methods of government. Just foregrounding, like looking over to chapter 11, where he's talking about Mississippi and Louisiana. To contrast, what he says is how in two other states with Black majorities, enfranchised labor led by educated men and groups of their own blood, sought to guide, etc., failed before land monopoly and the new power of imported capital and organized force and fraud. So Black majority becoming the leading sector, gaining power versus not, right? That's what sets South Carolina apart on its very, very basic level, and it's a different story from these other chapters. But we can't help to begin with first and foremost the title of this chapter and the very peculiar asterisk that the title has, right? The chapter, first of all, is called The Black Proletariat in South Carolina. That's the leading sector, the central actor. But there's a big asterisk right there that leads you to this incredibly astonishing footnote where Du Bois says, the record of the Negro worker during Reconstruction presents an opportunity to study inductively the Marxian theory of the state. We could say more about inductivity, right? Like you're studying from below, studying from the grassroots level, studying beginning with reality. I first called this chapter The Dictatorship of the Black Proletariat in South Carolina. That was his original title for the chapter. But it has been brought to my attention that this would not be correct, since universal suffrage does not lead to a real dictatorship, and so the workers use their votes consciously to rid themselves of the domination of private capital. And he says there were signs of this, but they were always limited by factors that we've seen, contradictions, individualism, the kind of American assumption idea that undermines the sort of collective vision. But Du Bois is saying that he almost called this chapter The Dictatorship of the Black Proletariat, which is just wild to begin with. But he realized that this would have been some kind of exaggeration and it would have been inaccurate. Again, this is because, remember that for Du Bois and for many Marxists, the question of dictatorship is a question of transition, which is a question of time, right? The time necessary to transform economic structures, the time necessary to develop a level of collective organization, collective consciousness. And in this case, very importantly, the time necessary to overcome the contradictions within the working class, racial contradictions, and the so-called wages of whiteness. The dictatorship of Reconstruction, which Du Bois will come to kind of describe in different ways. He later describes it as a tendency toward a dictatorship. There are places where he describes it as a dictatorship of capital over, over property, some things like that, the dictatorship of the troops in support of labor. Like he says all these things to sort of describe and work around the fact that he is no longer comfortable calling it strictly the dictatorship of the proletariat, but he's trying to think in terms that point in that direction. The fundamental point, though, is that this dictatorship did not last long enough to become a true dictatorship of the proletariat. 8, 9, 10 years was not enough for these pieces to come together, and especially given the fact that they had this Achilles heel in that they rested upon the will and the political will and of the capitalists in the North. So that's a fundamental question. He begins this chapter once again with the propaganda of history that we studied in chapter 17. The first line, a great political scientist in one of the oldest and largest American universities. And then he proceeds to quote a academic who is essentially spewing race hatred and speaking of Black people as a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason. Right? Classic. But again, we're understanding the institutionalization of these racialist ideas in academic structures that then last for decades and decades, to the point where that's what Du Bois is writing against, right? These are the people in academia when Du Bois is writing. The implication of this, of course, is that Reconstruction was a failure from the jump, that it never should have been tested, it never should have been tried, that it was a mistake of epic proportions, that it was ultimately an attack on civilization itself, as Du Bois had put it previously. Now, this is upheld by a secondary problem that Du Bois emphasizes here. Again, this is something we've already talked about, which is, as Du Bois puts it, it's hard to test this dictum by facts, right? It's hard to test the fact that this was doomed to be, to be a failure, because the facts are so distorted by white supremacy, distorted by and clouded by racial bias, and also that the records have been destroyed, right? The actual records that would show most of what Reconstruction had accomplished. Many were burned, Many were destroyed because of the rollback of the process. And so Du Bois even says later in the chapter, he says his own study, in other words, this book, limps and gropes in the darkness as a result, because he's trying to get to that truth and get to that reality. But then he says even the very basic facts of that reality contradict this story, right? Namely, civilization did not collapse in the US South during Reconstruction, and the economy recovered on a basic level, right? It had been destroyed by war, that was the basis of the destruction, and it recovered. And you'll see, I think this is important to mention, that these state level chapters do a lot of what I would call kind of defensive work. You see Du Bois talking about, again, the strength of the economy, talking about the cotton crop, things that we wouldn't necessarily use to measure success, right? You see him talking about corruption a great deal. A lot of that, again, is to defend the Reconstruction process from the accusations against it, namely that it was fundamentally corrupt, and more importantly, that it was more corrupt than any other white government, right? And so he'll do a lot in all of these chapters. In every chapter, he stops himself and he says, well, let's look at corruption, right? And the answer is always, Black government is no more corrupt than white government. The source of that corruption is capitalism, right? And has been capitalism. And more specifically, in all of these cases, for the most part, it's actually the railway system, the expansion of the railroads and the railroad monopolies that are the source of the fundamental corruption that helps, that is used and becomes very important because it's used to discredit Reconstruction, right? The accumulation of debt, the inability to pay that debt, all of this is important. Again, for us, it feels like a defensive move because he's really trying to say, like, these governments were capable of governing in a responsible way, in a capitalist way, balancing the budget, etc. But it's important work for the task that he sets himself. Now, Du Bois locates the experience of Reconstruction and of formerly enslaved Black Americans in a far longer trajectory of centuries. And he's done this before, but here he does it by establishing a very specific relationship, again, which he poses throughout history, which seems paradoxical to us, and that's the relationship between dictatorship and democracy. Again, we are not taught to understand dictatorship in a particularly useful way. The liberal insistence is that dictatorship is and can only be the opposite of democracy. And yet that's not the way that Du Bois arranges these two pieces in conjunction with each other. He doesn't see dictatorship and democracy as flatly or mechanically opposed to each other, again, because he sees dictatorship as part of a transition. And he locates, again, in a sort of dynamic and dialectical way, he binds these together in a way that allows us to see Black workers, in this case, as part of a long trajectory of workers and the poor throughout history who are excluded from democracy and who gain access to it at a certain moment, right? He says, on 382, this is where he begins to describe it with a very dramatic sounding phrase. Since the beginning of time, most thinkers have believed that the vast majority of human beings are incorrigibly stupid and evil. Part of the story he's telling, though, is about the story of the emergence of large numbers of poor people, of workers, of those who were systematically excluded, even up to, around the time Du Bois is writing, in societies across the globe, right? This was nothing new. The ways in which the poor had been excluded, the ways that they weren't seen as educated enough, that they were seen as too, uneducated and incapable to participate in democracy. He's presenting this as a universal story into which poor Black people fit at a specific historical moment. And that's where the question of dictatorship arrives, right? He says, all men know that by the sheer weight of physical force, the mass of men must in the last resort become the arbiters of human action, right? Meaning the majority, meaning the largest group, among the population. But reason, skill, wealth, machines, and power may for long periods enable the few to control the many. But to what end? The current theory of democracy is that dictatorship is a stopgap pending the work of universal education, equitable income, and strong character. But always the temptation is to use the stopgap for narrower ends because intelligence, thrift, and goodness seem so impossibly distant for most men. And then he follows with this very famous phrase, we rule by junta, we turn fascist because we do not believe in men. all of this seems like a slightly strange way to begin to talk about abolition and to talk about the Reconstruction process in South Carolina. But it's fundamental to this question in the sense that he is posing the dictatorship of the Black proletariat as this transitional phase, right? And he mentioned it before, even in the contradictions among abolitionists who weren't necessarily immediately for the vote, right? They said, no, education must come first, or land redistribution must come first, and the ways in which it was capitalists who actually were pushing the vote onto abolitionists. And Du Bois is really engaging this question in a way that, again, shows Black workers as part of what he calls a normal working class movement, right? Not outside of, not separate from, just the ways in which all poor people had been excluded and had struggled for a kind of inclusion in democracy. And again, I'd mentioned this book as a sort of response to Alexander de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, this famous celebration of American democracy, because Du Bois sees in a similar way the tendency toward democracy, in other words, the expansion of democracy, the inclusion of more, and greater sectors of the poor and of the working classes as a powerful current in history, although he very much disagrees and differs from Tocqueville when it comes to the inevitability of that process, right? This story we're seeing is of a greater inclusion and then exclusion, right? A step forward and a step back. But also because Tocqueville, as many others do, separate American democracy from race, right? They celebrate the democracy over here without understanding that race and white supremacy were embedded within that vision from the very beginning. There are lots of different steps historically in this understanding. Thinkers, first of all, kept them very separate. Then thinkers argued there are several, clashing traditions within American, the American Republic, that were vying for control over one another. And then finally, a lot of people, Du Bois himself and others, began to just recognize that white supremacy was part of that American democracy from the beginning, but pointing toward some other possibility. And again, Du Bois's response was that it was the Black reconstruction of democracy that mattered, right? This is a very, very ambitious vision. Now, this is all extra framing around dictatorship, its dynamic relationship to democracy that Du Bois is offering in this chapter that he won't offer in the next chapters. And it's after this that he then dives directly into the question of what's going on the state level. Why South Carolina? What are the demographics? What is the social structure? And again, here, this is a state with a significant Black majority in which slavery was the driving force, according to Du Bois. The war had devastated the economy, of course, because slavery was the core of it. The war had devastated the economy, and the question of reconstructing that economy raised the same questions that we've seen it raise elsewhere, right? How do we get people to continue to work? What kind of force can be brought to bear on that laboring force to get them back onto the plantations? And there's actually a very, very interesting note that he throws into this description, but it's almost like this kind of explosive little note that some of you may have noticed toward the top of 384, that gestures toward the question of gendered labor and white supremacy, right? Did folks see this? It was just a very quick description of the sort of conditions after the war, and he writes, and this is a quote, "Could you but see these delicate ladies in houses void of furniture, reduced to the wash tub and the cook pot, your heart would bleed," right? The sad story of like white women's conditions after abolition and after the war. And Du Bois just adds very quickly, and then changes subjects, "There were other Carolina women, not to be sure, quote, ladies, to whom the chance to wash and cook for themselves spelled heaven in these days," right? Very, very interesting, and also very, very powerful phrase that really foregrounds questions that are raised later by great, sort of radical feminists like Hortense Spillers in particular, contemporary, really interesting contemporary thinkers like Shatima Threadcraft has a book about some of these questions, about specifically the ways in which the impact of race on gender led to very divergent outcomes. That maybe seemed like an obvious sort of point. But to the degree in which Spillers very famously formulates the institution of slavery as a degendering institution, right? One that doesn't simply subject Black women to an additional layer of oppression, right? Which would be the kind of very simplistic intersectional analysis, but that functions on the basis of excluding Black women from the category of women entirely, right? This leads to very different histories, very different forms of solidarity as possibility, right? And very different kinds of outcomes. And for example, leads to different understandings in the present of what a strategy looks like. And Threadcraft documented ways in which, in the aftermath of the Civil War, Black women in particular were struggling to reclaim domestic space, right? As opposed to fighting against the domestic, we're saying, well, we've been excluded from this space for so long, we need to be able to reclaim it. And there's very interesting moments where there are schools that white women established to teach Black women to be women, right? It's already interesting in and of itself, but those schools are bombed by white supremacists, right? Because they want to really uphold this sort of gendered racial line that is so crucial. So Du Bois just throws this in here. It's very, very interesting again and explosive, and it's a piece that we want to sort of bear in mind because it's not present throughout the text. Du Bois begins to explain the dynamic of what's going on in South Carolina. Again, recall, Johnson is an immediate enemy of radical Reconstruction. He's trying to embrace the most minimal path toward Reconstruction because he's being flattered by these Southern planters. So he names a provisional governor from the very beginning, immediately, 1865, in mid-1865, who proves to be a sort of complete disappointment. Du Bois documents the fact that an early convention, constitutional convention, is established, which leads to an election, which leads to an early legislature, which, as he puts it, took some steps toward democracy, meaning it eliminated some property requirements for the vote, but still meaning only for white people, and that it refused apportionment of all Black people, which again, recall, that's a demand of the white supremacist planters because they want to claim all of those representatives for their power in Congress. So that's rejected at least. But at the same time, this early, again, pre-radical Reconstruction legislature in South Carolina imposes what Du Bois calls one of the most vicious of the Black codes, right? And we've talked about what Black codes look like, the degree to which they attempt to reinforce and reestablish a racialized labor force through legal mechanisms. So clearly, this is the direction that this sort of like soft Reconstruction is going, is toward the restitution of slavery in another name. Simultaneously, though, you've got very interesting things happening along the coast, where from 1861 on, you have what was referred to as the Port Royal experiment, where lands were redistributed directly to formerly enslaved people, right, under military rule. Where later, and this is kind of reinforced very famously by Sherman's field order, Special Field Order 15, which through a lot of sections of the South redistributes land immediately to those who had formerly worked it, right? This is something that had been established through the war and again through a special military order, but Johnson and these state governments are busy kind of in this early period rolling it back, right? Expelling people from the land that had been given to them when these plantations had been broken up early on. Again, this is 1865, 66, 67, these things are being rolled back. Radical Reconstruction kicks in 67 and 68 through the broad arc of the dynamic we've seen. Again, 1867 Reconstruction law is one of many pieces of legislation that is only passed over Johnson's veto. He vetoes it, Congress says, fuck you, we're gonna pass it again with a 2/3 majority, and they do that over and over and over again. This is the constitutional crisis that, again, whip of the counter-revolution that set everything into motion. And that, on the local level in South Carolina, then leads to a new constitutional convention, right? One grounded in abolition and then ultimately in the vote, right? So writing a new constitution on the basis of Black suffrage. And so what this looks like concretely is a new election for a constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution, in which more than, I believe, the numbers that he gave were a little vague between who was registered and who voted, but more than 100,000 people voted in this new election to establish a constitutional convention. By contrast, the earlier convention established right after the war, under the provisional governor named by Johnson, 19,000 people voted, right? All white people, all property owners. So already you see this dramatic expansion of the electorate in this election to the Constitutional Convention, and it's aided by the fact that that white planters encourage white people to boycott the election, so they don't vote. The result of this is, as Du Bois describes it, out of 124 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, or the Constituent Assembly, 76 were Black, right? Dramatic majority. Of those, 57 had formerly been enslaved, meaning just a couple of years before. That is who is in power when radical Reconstruction kicks in South Carolina. This, in and of itself, is revolutionary, right? The idea that, particularly a couple of years after the war, an absolutely unthinkable situation in which the state is being governed by mostly the vast majority of Black people and nearly a majority of people who had just been enslaved a couple of years before. At the same time, it's kind of unthinkable today, right? Like, can we imagine South Carolina governed entirely and in its majority by Black people? It's kind of wild that 150 years later, that's just as hard for us to kind of envision as well. Du Bois quotes of this kind of early convention, he quotes contemporary newspaper accounts about how effective the Black legislators were. And even accounts, and it's really wild language, even accounts that describe them as unlettered Ethiopians describe them as being better legislators than the elected, white people in the Constituent Assembly. The real opposition, Du Bois said, even in that moment to this Constituent Assembly, was economic. He said the problem for the system of power was that those who had been elected were majority poor, Black and white. That this Constituent Assembly that was rewriting the Constitution and the fundamental laws of the country were drawn from the poor. This, to Du Bois, is very revealing already, because he says, this is at the top of 391, he says, it was singularly to the credit of these voters that poverty was so well represented. It showed certain tendencies toward a dictatorship of the proletariat. How does an election show tendencies toward the dictatorship of the proletariat? He just means the fact that poor people voted for poor people. He said already that is enough to tell you that there's some level of class consciousness that says poor people will represent me better than rich people. Again, I wish we had that level of class consciousness in this country today. So he's saying that is like a very basic indication of what he calls a tendency toward the dictatorship of the proletariat, because what you're thinking is that you can use elections to institute some kind of class representation that can point toward class power. The Constitutional Convention showed these same tendencies in its conversations, in its discussions, in its debates, and ultimately in its outcomes. They debated questions of debt, they debated questions of land, labor, property qualifications for the vote extensively. And South Carolina is incredibly crucial because it allows us to see what kind of legislative policy outcomes were the result of this Black majority, working class majority government, right? Land. It wasn't full redistribution. There were conversations in the Constitutional Assembly in South Carolina about full redistribution of land, about really truly breaking up the plantations, but these were sort of hamstrung. They didn't reach all the way, but they did impose some level of expropriation and redistribution, and they did create a state level agency that aided people in purchasing land at prices that were fixed, right? So there was an attempt and there was a goal of engaging in some kind of land redistribution in South Carolina. On 396, you get a lot of the very important, summaries that Du Bois is offering. On the question of race, as Du Bois writes, the convention attacked race discrimination squarely. Discriminations of race and color were abolished by the Constitution, and practical application was attempted in the case of public schools and the militia. Interesting to just really emphasize the fact that meaning race discrimination was abolished in this case means a Black government said, we're not going to discriminate against white people, right? That was, that's part of what's implied by this abolition of race discrimination. On the question of suffrage and the vote, Du Bois describes South Carolina as carrying out what he calls the most liberal provisions for the right of suffrage. They did not attempt, as Virginia, Alabama, and Mississippi did, to restrict the voting of whites further. Reconstruction, in other words, expanded and increased the ability of poor white people to even vote. whereas other states had used that opportunity to restrict it. On the question of women's rights, Du Bois says the rights of women were enlarged. He specifically names questions of the sale of debt. A woman's debt could not be sold. Property could not be sold to pay off the debt of her husband. And the state passed a divorce law. On the question of education, South Carolina established a free common school, in other words, a public school. This, for Du Bois, is going to be the most powerful legacy of Reconstruction, is the establishment of public schools. And he's going to say in one of his sort of like last chapters, a very interesting chapter, also very peculiarly located in the book, but important for him, that essentially free public education is something that Black people made possible and created in this country. Right? That is a huge lesson of what Du Bois is trying to drive home here, and South Carolina is a big piece of where it is seen. On broader questions of class and economic sort of condition, Du Bois emphasizes the fact that the South Carolina legislature abolished debt imprisonment, right? And debt bondage, abolished dueling, and did away with property qualifications for voting or holding office. It also made other more radical economic proposals that Du Bois mentions, but he said, as he put it, they came 50 years too early. So they were thinking ahead. And that's actually an important thread of this chapter, is that South Carolina is really at the vanguard of passing legislation that the world had not seen in many senses. And I'll return to this. And on broader questions of, it's under health here, but it's, a very, very broad question of public health in general, but specifically the establishment of institutions to care for orphans, as well as those with physical and psychological disabilities. All of these had been unthinkable and, parts of, what we understand to be the obligations of the state in the US. And again, this is in a context in which the so-called social question, in other words, capitalism creating poverty that needs to be dealt with by the government, it's only at this point that any country on earth is beginning to think in these terms, right? So that's all to drive home just how much of a vanguard South Carolina is in this sense. As Du Bois puts it on, this is now on 401, the convention had a vision of prosperity, and they wanted railroads, schools, and poorhouses, and a redistribution of land. All of this is happening despite the fact that, as Du Bois then shows in a series of legislative elections, there was kind of a white veto in the Senate that existed, right? So all of this is happening despite the fact that poor white people in the Senate of the state could have blocked it, but of course didn't, right? Didn't, because it was seen as good legislation. And the flip side of this for Du Bois is that it wasn't just Black people who were in power, right? In other words, the limitations, the mistakes, the errors, the corruption was not only to be understood as being on, the backs of Black people either. And even after the abolition of slavery, maybe people have heard of the phrase of the mudsill. The category of the mudsill is this very interesting reformulation of biological understandings of race to expand it to a broader class framework, in which there's this argument that every society needs a mudsill. Mudsill is like the sort of foundation of a house that's sort of embedded in the ground, essentially right above the mud. But it was used as a phrase, particularly in the South, to say every society needs a lowest rung of society to do the sort of uneducated work, to do the manual labor, even if it's not, Black people, which the argument was built into it that biologically this is who should be doing it. Even if it wasn't, there had to be another class to do that, right? And so one of the questions posed in this very interesting quote on page 405 is, what is the effect on democracy when the bottom rail is on the top, right? When the mudsill becomes the governing force, when the structure of power is inverted. Again, this points us toward, on the one hand, the question of what abolition democracy means, which I consistently have sort of kind of reiterated to folks as a qualitative question. What kind of democracy becomes possible when that inversion happens, right? And it points toward a very important question of the universal nature of Reconstruction, right? And the question is fundamentally, who was Reconstruction for? And the answer is for everyone. Now, there's a huge exception here, which is indigenous people, which we obviously need to think very, very carefully about. But the universalizing nature of Reconstruction is the essence that Du Bois is trying to draw out. And on the one hand, this is, this cuts against the fundamental assumptions that white supremacy imposes and expects, right? Which is to say, and we know this very clearly from many other experiences in sort of global history, but also we know it from the sort of guilty conscience of white America today, which is the idea that black people in power means they're going to repress white people, right? That there's some sort of retribution that's going to come, some kind of vengeance that's going to come, and that's not the case, right? It's the systems in power that are brutal, that are violent, that are oppressive, and those who resist those systems more often than not do so for the goal of abolishing them as a whole, right? This is the category that someone like Marx would ascribe to the proletariat by calling that class a universal class, right? Very, very basic sort of like, Marxism 101 type stuff is the fact that the reason the proletariat plays a certain role in Marx's understanding of history is that the proletariat struggles for no particular interest. In other words, not so that it itself can gain power in its own interest, right? But that the seizing of power by the proletariat means the abolition of that power structure and that class structure. Why does it mean that? Because it's the lowest of the low, the class that has nothing to lose but its chains, right? Of course, the missing piece here is the fact that in concrete reality, the white working class sometimes has something to lose, and that there are other classes that are quite literally in chains, right? And so Du Bois is pointed toward the ways in which Black proletarians in power truly point toward a universal class, truly point toward a class that by seizing power, by taking power, are not trying to govern for themselves and their own privileges and their own new power structure, but are trying to abolish the very parameters of that power structure, if that makes sense. Reconstruction as universal project. We can take some questions on that. It seems like a good place to stop before I just spend the whole session talking. For the tech team that wasn't here last week, there was some competition between the chat and the folks in the room, and I believe those in the chat described it as chat supremacy. Yeah, I know, right? Those in the chat were claiming that they had better questions than folks in the room, but I believe in the in-person crew today.
My question was about just on page 382, the bottom. He says like, "We rule by agenda, we rule fascists because we do not believe in men." I'm just curious if you have insight into like the time frame in which Du Bois is writing about fascism and like the understanding of that term, because was this like the 1930s or so, like when like Mussolini was like just kind of was like establishing himself. I'm curious like what his understanding of that was and maybe how it's different from how we understand it now.
No, it's a great point. So the book comes out in 1935. Of course, he had been writing it before that, but it comes out in 35. So fascism is very much on the agenda, right? I was going to say it's clear what fascism is doing, but to be completely honest, particularly in the US, there's a denial of what fascism is actually doing for a great, for many years past that, obviously. Particularly when it comes to Nazi Germany, right? There's a denial right up to like 1940, 1941. So it's important to recognize that he's very early in identifying what's going on in fascism. But it's not hard for him to identify, I don't think. First of all, because he's got ties to the communist movement. And second of all, because he can see in fascism a sort of prototype of how he's trying to understand and analyze the generalized, hatred of people deemed inferior, right? That is the structure of white supremacy too, right? So part of what he's saying is, like classic Fred Hampton, right? Which is like, if you hate socialism, you hate yourself, right? We establish fascism because we don't want to expand this democracy to include poor people, to include the so-called unlettered masses, right? The uneducated, those who are not fit to govern. And it's a sort of like attempt to cling, an anachronistic attempt to cling on to a vertical power structure in a moment in which it has to be kind of expanding. But yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that there's a clear diagnosis of what fascism is already doing. And again, when we say 1935, we mean he's kind of done writing it in 1934 or even earlier. And so that's very early, right? To recognize, what Mussolini is doing with a clarity, and on a very, very early level, what Hitler is doing as well. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
From David in the chat. Is there any remnants of this progressive inversion of political power left in South Carolina today? They seem like one of the more far right state legislatures and have made the Confederacy such a huge part of their identity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'm not maybe equipped to answer the specific question about South Carolina, but I think it's true that it is not. That this progressive sort of element is not still present. As I said, it's hard to imagine Black political power in South Carolina in general, but even if that were possible, which it is kind of possible, like we very much doubt the content of what that would mean, right? At the end, we're going to talk about a very important quote that is drawn from debates and discussions in 1895 when the Reconstruction Constitution is being rewritten, right? When the right wing is back in power, the planter class is back in power, Jim Crow is being imposed, and they're rewriting the Constitution to get rid of all of these progressive elements, right? So that's part of the story, right? The quote will be pointing us in a different direction, but that's partly to say that part of what happens is that these constitutions are scrapped and rewritten after, after Reconstruction is dismantled, in an attempt to dismantle all of those progressive pieces, right? And I often point to the way, we don't think about constitutions enough. We think about the national constitution, we don't think about state constitutions enough, but also just in general, like, I feel like maybe we've mentioned this before. There's a mass rebellion in Chile a few years ago. It's still in certain ways ongoing in an attempt at a constitutional reform, because the constitution in Chile is still the fascist constitution from the 1970s, right? Meaning that, and again, that doesn't mean it looks like fascism every day, but it means things like privatization of education, privatization of access to water, like all of these crazy neoliberal, elements that were imposed by the dictatorship, right? So the way that these are written into law is a huge part of why South Carolina then is, the way that it is today.
This might be just a definition question, or it could be a larger ideological question, but why call it the dictatorship of the proletariat? Because that to me seems kind of linguistically like an oxymoron, sort of, but I don't know if I just don't understand the language of dictatorship or not. Or
it seems oxymoronic to say dictatorship on the one hand and proletariat on the other.
To me.
Yeah, right?
I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the question. I think, I probably wasn't super clear, but I think that's part of what Du Bois is trying to, part of what seems weird to us is that we're surrounded by a fucking liberalism that says dictatorship is the worst thing in the world and can only be understood as fascism. I think that's part of this, right? He is coming from a tradition that says, you know what, like we need a certain kind of dictatorship that allows for us to, again, transform the economy, transform consciousness. It's a transition to a new kind of world in which, we will, a world which will be for him far more democratic, directly democratic, right? And that seems strange to us, to unite the two. But actually, there's a really important piece here that I'll mention a little more at the end, but it's an important question to bring in here, which is the fact that if you look at the history of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a category, it's not, it shouldn't be understood as something that comes from above. Again, I feel like I am too often referencing the Black Jacobins. And so I was saying earlier that our next sort of like, podcast will probably be on the Black Jacobins just because it's so crucial. But there's this footnote that C.L.R. James adds to the 1963 edition of the Black Jacobins, which is incredibly crucial because he's showing the degree to which the Jacobins, who are the sort of radical wing of the French Revolution, how those Jacobins in power in the French Assembly are not the same thing as the grassroots sans-culottes, like the sort of rebellious masses in the streets, right? They're both parts of this sort of left wing of the revolution, but he says the Jacobins wanted to govern for the people, and they wanted to carry out the dictatorship from above, and the grassroots wanted to carry out the dictatorship by themselves, right? My point being the fact that the dictatorship could and should be understood as something that the people carry out on their own, right? What does that mean? It means the people can repress their own enemies, right? It means the people can dismantle, the capitalist infrastructure on their own, right? It means that the people can provide, and this happens a lot in like revolutionary moments, not only militia-based self-defense, but also like a powerful oversight mechanism to identify people who are hoarding, to identify capitalists who are just, harming the people and harming the population, right? So the people have a great deal of influence when it comes to this question of what the dictatorship looks like, right? And so for me, dictatorship of the proletariat is a transitional term, but it also is one that reaches out conceptually toward the category of the commune, which is one that I'll sort of maybe talk about toward the end. But again, I don't think dictatorship doesn't need to be understood as a vertical thing. It can be something that people carry out directly on their own, which gets to the question we've raised before about what other kind of dictatorship could have existed if it wasn't the federal troops, right? And the answer is armed Black self-defense movements, right? The kind that were targeted by the Klan.
In South Carolina, what might have it taken to fully include / involve Native peoples in the project of radical Reconstruction?
Yeah.
Was it possible at the time?
Was it possible at the time? Yes, of course. I mean, I think it definitely was possible. There are a lot of super contradictory pieces that are going on at the same time. I'm not sure I'll be able to give a great answer because there's so many different ways of answering it. We're putting out a book, maybe this year, maybe next, on Black Reconstruction, but it's an edited volume. And in that book, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz has a great chapter about sort of, the question of indigenous struggles around the time of Reconstruction. And there are a lot of really interesting and contradictory things that are happening, right? And dynamics that we don't, I think, fully understand. For example, just one of which is the fact that indigenous communities who were expelled along the Trail of Tears often brought enslaved people with them, right? And that's both, shocking to hear and to internalize and think about in certain ways. But what's also interesting is that those enslaved people then were legally understood as citizens of those indigenous nations, right? Rather than being citizens of the United States. And so there's a lot of really interesting and complicated shit that's happening. And simultaneously, there are questions of the, indigenous laws that are being passed in and after, during and after Reconstruction. Lincoln, of course, massacring indigenous people as well, but which are being understood as, in certain ways, progressive because their goal is to incorporate indigenous people into US citizenship, but the way of doing that is to individualize them by destroying community, right? This is a classic strategy of settler colonialism, which is to say, turn indigenous people into citizens or into workers or into farmers, right? By stripping them of that collective, claim to the land. And so it's framed and understood in certain ways as progressive. So what it would take to truly incorporate would have been, in some ways, a radical shift in our frame. Although there are places even in here that Du Bois identifies progressive legislation, in these states to include indigenous people, to be making claims for and by indigenous people, although it's sort of few and far between. And really, again, part of the really important things to remember on a historical level is that indigenous people are simultaneously being radically dispossessed at this moment. Do we have any more in the room? Okay, cool.
Thank you. Kind of building off some earlier questions. I'm curious about, that footnote where he starts about saying this is sort of a way for us to inductively look at Marxian theories of the state, and then the way that he's talking about class and proletarianism, and thinking about this coming out in 1935 and the big shifts in the communist line to Popular Front anti-fascism, and sort of shifts in how communist movements were thinking about race at the time. And I'm just curious, maybe this is I'm asking for a spoiler alert, but where does he where do you think he's taking us towards in terms of like thinking about like race and class as separable, as like ultimately co-constitutive, as like like where does he land in the middle of these like very fractious debates then and now around like who is the class that brings revolution, etc.
Well, he's clear, I think, on who that class is most consistently, right? He says, or the class and the group that brings democracy, right? On a very, very basic level. He says democracy died saving the souls of Black people, right? That's it. Didn't have to be that way for him, but was likely to be that way, probably. The answer in some way comes from the piece you began with, right? Which, as I said, when we're reading that footnote, he says to study inductively the Marxian theory of the state. Inductively, because again, and this is super interesting, and it's for me it's a shared principle of revolutionary third world Marxism, of the kind that we talk about all the time at abolition school, that we study these things inductively, right? We don't read Marx and say we assume these categories map onto our reality. We start with our reality and build up toward the categories, right? And again, we start with materialist analysis, which is to say, I mean, that's putting into practice what Marx argues, but we allow the categories to shift on the basis of what we're seeing around us. That's what it means to do inductive work, right? Not just assume deductively that the categories fit, but to sort of build up from the reality. That's what Moriarty does. That's what Walter Rodney, Amilcar Cabral, and that's what Du Bois does. All of that is to say it doesn't fit with his contemporary Marxism, right? And part of the, one symptom of how it doesn't fit is the fact that he's not a member of the Communist Party. He is close to and sympathetic with, but for exactly these same reasons, right? And I'll go on and on about this all the time. It doesn't fit within the framework of what the Communist Party is necessarily proposing at that time, right? And there are people who join the party and then leave because they want to be part of this, but they're struggling with the fact that it cannot adapt to the inductive reality of Black American life, right? Or that struggle, or even to understand, as James puts it, right, the fact that Black struggle is proletarian struggle, right? It's very, very difficult to grasp. And that's, in a sort of nutshell, what Du Bois is trying to show, right? In this case, he's trying to say, listen, like if we want to think about the dictatorship of the proletariat, let's not just, again, impose those categories onto reality. Let's think about what's actually playing out. And what you see is very complicated, right? He's talking about the Louisiana legislature, the South Carolina State House. That's not where you would normally locate the dictatorship of the proletariat. But he's trying to very dialectically, which is to say, to understand the fact that that building is just a building which could be filled with revolution or it could be filled with reaction, right? And in this case, he's trying to identify those ways in which it was filled with a revolutionary content. That's a very complex thing for a traditional Marxist, I think, to sort of accept or recognize. And I will go right into this right now, because this is something I was going to mention at the end, but it's really related to this question, which is the fact that Du Bois is talking about the dictatorship of the Black proletariat, and he's saying, well, that doesn't exactly fit. Later, a great comrade who passed just a few years ago, Noel Ignatiev, would write about what he called the South Carolina Commune, right? He would say this was communism, this was the commune. Also an exaggeration, right? You know what I mean? Like, but Ignatiev's point, which was incredibly crucial, is that the American blind spot, the racial blind spot, prevented workers, as he put it, from, they were looking across the ocean to the Paris Commune in 1871 for inspiration, and they couldn't look 500 miles south, he said. They couldn't see the communism that was developing in their own country, right? And that really gets to this question, right? Why is this blind spot so fatal to the understanding of Black struggle as class struggle and the potential for class unity? So that's an incredible, crucial piece. And on a conceptual level, this gets to the thing about the dictatorship, right? Dictatorship and commune kind of reach out toward each other, right? Commune is the permanent governance of a free society. Dictatorship is how we get there. But again, insofar as the dictatorship of the proletariat means armed communities taking care of themselves, rooting out capitalism, changing the structure of the economy, that's the progression that that leads toward and institutes communal governance, right? So the two have to be understood in relationship to each other, meaning that, as Du Bois is arguing, dictatorship is not the opposite of democracy. It's a pathway there. and its actual democratization is a process of communism, which Marx describes as the real movement, right? The real movement which abolishes the existing order of things. Right? Cool. This had to be destroyed, clearly. It was a threat to property. It was a threat to white supremacy. It wasn't actually a threat to white people, which is the way it had been framed, is the way things are framed today, of course, but it was a threat to the power that white supremacy, was embedded within, which was also an economic power. The universalism, the universal project of Reconstruction, the threat of what one critic described as a union of poor whites and Negroes, in other words, again, a repeat of the Bacon's rebellion narrative of 1670s, 200 years earlier, right? In which poor blacks and poor whites, both indentured, rose up together against the planter class, and led to the establishment of a racial binary and its sort of, the racialization of slavery as hereditary. This was being replayed 200 years later, right? The fear of the union of poor whites and black workers, the process of the universalization of these social rights, and the fact that they threatened property in a very active way in South Carolina, that things were getting out of control, led to both, of course, planters and plantation owners and southern elites being incredibly scared. But it also led to what ultimately, leads to the withdrawal of Reconstruction by Northern capitalists. Du Bois documents the different steps in this process, right? I mean, I describe this just kind of using his analysis as the ways in which Reconstruction was hollowed out from within by sabotage, essentially, the refusal to pay taxes, the inability of the state to then, collect those taxes contributes to this massive indebtedness that's happening, and the encouragement, as he puts it, of corruption, the very same corruption that then would be blamed on black self-rule, right, is part of this process of sabotage that he's identifying. And then this internal hollowing out of Reconstruction leads to the overt aggression that he then describes as what he calls the Mississippi Plan. The defeat of Reconstruction in South Carolina, again, in a state where a black majority elected a black majority, ultimately came back to and centered on the question of the vote, right? It's not reducible to the question of the vote for reasons that Du Bois is trying to identify, right? Simply having the right to vote does not mean that you can vote. That's an essential piece of what he's trying to say. But in a state in which that was being expressed at the ballot box, this question had to be raised. And so he documents, this is over on like page 412, the three different strategies that white opponents of Reconstruction in South Carolina embraced. The first was to kind of accept this as the new reality, accept black suffrage, accept the vote, and adapt to it. The second was to control it. And this is very important because it foregrounds the different strategies that will play out in other states that he'll describe in the next chapters, right? The ability of certain planters to ally themselves with the black vote and use that vote to their benefit, right? Although one particularly racist commenter that he quotes in here describes that as an attempt to control a herd of wild buffaloes, as he puts it. So there's an argument that we should, black people are going to vote, we'll just control and manipulate that vote as much as we can. And then the third alternative was to oppose the black vote completely, right? This he ascribes in particular to Perry, who is the one who is particularly worried about this joint proletarian revolution. And according to Du Bois, this is ultimately what wins out, right? And it wins out for several reasons, but it also wins out because of what's happening on the national level in terms of the 1876 compromise. But this last strategy of attempting to oppose the existence of the black vote is what he calls the Mississippi Plan, because it's what will be carried out in other parts, of the South. And it means what Du Bois describes as overthrowing the black vote by brute force, right? Meaning, again, you have a right to vote, but we will use force to prevent you from doing so. And then, I mean, the chain is very clear, right? You prevent people from voting, you elect who you want to elect. Those people in power then rewrite the laws and establish black codes and establish ultimately, disenfranchise the very people that you have just prevented from voting. Like that's how you get from black people are allowed to vote to black people are no longer allowed to vote, right? You don't get there because a majority of black people say we don't want to vote anymore. There has to be an intermediary, which in this case is violence, force, terrorism, right? In this context, which of course is a context of, in which the planter class and the capitalist are being, scared off. Du Bois also, and I just don't, want to make sure that we mention it, he documents the emergence in the early period of the consolidation of a very radical black labor movement, very aggressive, movement, which, is worth emphasizing because it's part of this sort of like polarization and this conflict and this tension that leads to capital getting scared, but which is also part of the process of the dictatorship establishing a different kind of power. At the top of 417, and really reading this to remember it, and because it's kind of fun, they talk about these sort of wildcat strikes in which, this is 1876, this is right at the end of Reconstruction, right? A strike of farm laborers in Culleton County. They threatened to destroy the crops of the planters. Another strike occurred in the rice fields of Beaufort County, where 200 Negroes at harvest time demanded an advance of wages. They imprisoned scabs in the outhouses and overpowered the sheriff and his posses. But the governor sent the colored leader, Robert Smalls, with a company of militia, and the mob was dispersed. Some of the rice plantations in South Carolina struck for wages and used much violence toward non-strikers, hunting them about with whips, right? So we're talking about a real radical wildcat labor movement that's emerging at the same time. And this is part of the fear, right? And if I said white workers couldn't recognize this as communism, what was emerging in South Carolina, the rich did, right? You can find denunciations where they're saying these are the communists, right? These are the communists in our own country. This is a fifth column. They are undermining our power, and they're very clear about it. It's the working class that wasn't clear about it, right? And the white poor in particular, which we'll get to, who are the foot soldiers of the Klan, right? They're the ones who are actually making this happen. Ultimately, for Du Bois, the arguments that are made for the dismantling of Reconstruction, specifically in South Carolina, they emerge from an economic motivation, but they are phrased in the most straightforward of racial terms, right? They're justified through racial categories, they're justified through racial metaphors, and yet ultimately they are based on this concern and this fundamental opposition to the fact that it was the poor ruling the rich, as Du Bois puts it. That was what was so unacceptable. That was what could not be tolerated. And if you turn over to 428, this is the quote that I was mentioning earlier, and it's sort of what I think I want to close with. Again, this is a quote. This is toward the top of 428. This is a speech being given in 1895, again, in the context of the attempt to rewrite the South Carolina Constitution to eliminate all traces of Reconstruction. And this is a black leader who had been a participant, right, who was speaking against this rewriting and against the dismantling. And he says, "We were 8 years in power. We had built schoolhouses, established charitable institutions, built and maintained the penitentiary system," interesting, "provided for the education of the deaf and dumb, rebuilt the jails and courthouses, rebuilt the bridges, and reestablished the ferries. In short, we had reconstructed the state and placed it upon the road to prosperity, and at the same time, by our acts of financial reform, had, essentially talking about the debt. We were 8 years in power, right? And then documenting some of these major contributions of the Reconstruction era. And it's important to understand and to think about the project again in universal terms, to think about what the contributions had been. But Du Bois adds to this, very interestingly in the next passage, "It seemed fairly clear that what South Carolina wanted was not reform, even in its narrower sense, What it was attacking was not even stealing and corruption. If there was one thing that South Carolina feared more than bad Negro government, it was good Negro government. All of the arguments about corruption, about the failures, about the impossibility of self-government under Reconstruction, self-government by formerly enslaved people, all of that was based on the sort of inversion of the guilty conscience that says that these people are, of course, fundamentally human, able to govern themselves, and the last thing we want to see is proof that that's possible, right? So we have to deny it all the way down. If there was one thing South Carolina feared more than bad Negro government, it was good Negro government. And so the Reconstruction Project had to be destroyed because of its successes, right? Not because of its purported failures. Part of the reason that I want to end on this is not only because it's powerful and resonant when we think about the legacies of Reconstruction, but because it provided the title for Ta-Nehisi Coates in a short book called We Were 8 Years in Power. And the reference point for Coates is the Obama years, which is very, very interesting. And part of me was just like, why the fuck would that be the title of a book about the Obama years? And Coates is not, he's not an unintelligent analyst, right? He's also not totally a liberal. But part of what he's trying to say is that something similar is happening under the Obama years, and then there's something about this fear of good, of good Black government that's going on as well. That then it becomes clear in the sort of Trump backlash against the Obama presidency. But it seems like an impossible metaphor to me, right? It seems like comparing Reconstruction to the Obama years is incredibly misguided. It whitewashes so much of what Obama's legacy was for, it's quite simply not what Du Bois meant by good government, right? It isn't, right? And when Coates is kind of enunciating this, it's a very brief, because it's a collection of essays, it's this very brief little preface. He talks about healthcare, but that's the Affordable Care Act, right? He talks about eliminating torture, which we know is not true. He admits that the wars were ongoing. And so you're really left wondering what was the basis of the good government, right? And it seems to really reduce to the fact that it was attacked for being good, which, again, the right-wing attacks on Obama are very real, but they don't mean that what's being attacked is really there, if that makes sense, right? Socialism, right? This idea, of this sort of, fake idea of socialism. And for Du Bois, there's the good government, right, was ultimately and tendentially, meaning that it slid inevitably toward a tax on property. It slid inevitably toward economic equality. And again, he says this over and over again, if you're talking about democracy, and if you're talking about democracy that includes poor people, those poor people will eventually and should use those votes to improve their conditions, and they can only improve their conditions through economic solidarity and ultimately this tendency toward the dictatorship of labor, right? Absent that, I just don't know, I don't understand how you could possibly call that anything, or even use the metaphor in any kind of similar ways. And so I don't think the metaphor fits that Coates is trying to apply to the Obama years. I'd be curious to hear arguments for why it might. I know Du Bois is not making it absolute. Again, he's the one who's saying that this very partial experiment was, much more radical than we understand it to be. But I still don't see how that maps on. So I'm curious to hear if anyone would want to defend the metaphor in that usage. But at the very least, the idea we were 8 years in government is a resonant one for thinking about the question of dictatorship and the question of democracy. Cool. Before we go to these last questions, I would just say, next week, again, we're going into kind of hyperdrive to just speed through these other states. You'll see why when you start to read it. Last time we ran this seminar, we were like, we're going to read all the chapters. And then we got like halfway through some of these chapters and we're like, oh, okay, like this is why people don't read all of these chapters, because it's very interesting. But what he's doing is like, he'll be like, and then in Tennessee, and then in Louisiana, and then in, and he'll do a lot of the same moves, right? So there's a lot of repetitiveness. It's very interesting to understand the differences between the different states. So I encourage you to, first of all, look at the recommended page, page ranges to emphasize as you move through those chapters. and think on a very basic level, why does he arrange the chapters in the way that he does, which we've already suggested a little bit about, and how is he thinking about the different forces at play, right? Because there are some states where he's saying the primary force are poor whites, and here's what they're doing. Other states where the primary force are poor black people, and this is what they're doing, right? And to pay close attention to those kind of larger parameters. Cool. But for now, let's have some questions from the chat in the room. Don't let the chat show you up.
I don't know if this is something he gets to eventually, but it's something that you're referencing, like 8 years was not long enough. Like,
No, not even close.
does
Yeah.
he ever get to an implication of like how long it would have taken ideally, or like is that something that as he's like thinking through his analysis of each state, like defers? Like in the case of South Carolina, I'm curious, like it seems like there's efforts towards like collaboration between poor whites and black people, and like are poor whites not getting, like the benefits they receive aren't enticing enough to like overcome this allegiance to the planter class? Like what is that? Yeah.
How long would be long enough? Like in the spirit of Du Bois, I want to answer by saying, listen, like Du Bois is telling a story of any working class or revolutionary movement, right? This is not particular, this is not specific, it's not even specifically about white supremacy, although that's a huge factor in how it plays out. But I say that in part because I'll say something like, it really depends on how folks come to power and how they're able to exercise that power, right? The Paris Commune, people seized a part of the city, but they did so by insurrectionary force, right? So they took it over. So at least within those small, like confines, there was no other power, right? In other words, there's no, you could immediately abolish capitalist exchange, right? You could, the army and the military and the police were not present. And so you move very quickly to the restructuring of society, right? On a small scale. That's not the whole thing. That raises other questions, right? If you look at other revolutionary processes like Cuba, very good example, right? Power is seized. Many elements of the former dictatorship and government flee. Many rich people flee, right? It's actually, in some ways, it's kind of a gift because all of a sudden you've got an island, which is literally an island also, that helps, in which many of your enemies have left, right? They don't need to be imprisoned, they don't need to be killed, they don't need to be re-educated, right? Like they're gone, much, much easier. Like, and when you control the mechanisms of the state fully and you're able to use those tools to control currency, to control the distribution in the economy, you can do things much more quickly. And still then it takes a long time. Still then it takes decades, right? Why? Because this is one of the main contributions that Che Guevara makes to revolutionary theories, to think about revolutionary culture and what he calls the rebuilding of new people, right? And that takes time. We're neoliberal capitalist individuals, no matter what we think of ourselves, and it takes a while, and it takes the real possibility of an alternative for us to become a culture to something different. Venezuela, which I talk about a lot because I spend a lot of time there, is an attempt to build a revolutionary process in a very capitalist, consumerist society and in a context of democracy and elections, right? This poses incredibly important challenges to how we understand that timeline, to how we understand what it even means to have power, because part of what I argue from the very beginning is we talk about seizing power, but the president was elected and he was great, but the entire bureaucracy of the state was still in the hands of many different pieces, right? And different forces and different classes and elements of the bureaucracy and the capitalist class. All of that is incredibly complicated. And that's sort of what Du Bois is talking about here, right? He's talking about one state in a federal system that in which you can seize electoral control and you have to keep getting elected, right? And ultimately you can be discredited by the indebtedness that capitalism is imposing upon your state, right? That's part of how it collapses, right? Is that the same capitalism that they're standing against is literally stealing what would today be trillions of dollars in state credit to build railroads to then benefit themselves as private capitalists, and it's the state that has to pay that bill. And the fact that that debt exists is used to discredit Reconstruction and say, we need to get rid of this, right? So it's very complicated, right? Again, all of those factors make it more complicated. What is the context? You're within capitalism, a small piece, right? Like in a broad context, and you're trying to do so through elections and without fully kind of cutting the Gordian knot and just like taking over militarily the entirety of the space, if that makes sense. It's not a clear answer, but the question is decades and decades and decades, right? And again, because we're ultimately building new people, and that takes a long time. And so the question of the political will and how to understand such an extensive period of dictatorship is incredibly complicated. What else? You can do it. Well, no, that's the thing is you can do it faster, right? And that's the thing. Like, so if people are familiar with the idea of the shock doctrine, right? The idea that the right is very good at using shock, conflict, moments of even, people talk about a lot around, Hurricane Katrina, natural disasters, and then capitalists are able to swoop in, use that emergency in a way that the left has not been able to do it, right? One of the lessons that we need to learn from the right is that emergency and shock are part of how, we need to be able to move forward. And we know opposite. I mean, we know this is true because we see the opposite in the Democratic Party every day, which is this idea that somehow we can gradually talk our ways out of fascism somehow by accommodating it at every turn. So yeah, I think Joe has a question. If that's, what do you want to do on the chat?
What role did the differing pre-war economic histories, cotton versus rice dominated, for example, in the distinct ethnic groups like the Gullah, play in the differences of Reconstruction between states?
Yeah. So this question of different economic structures. I mean, I want to say, I don't want to overstate the impact, right? Because what we're talking about is actually very different systems, if that makes sense. It wasn't that there was one region where cotton grew better and one region where rice grew better, right? It was the fact that capitalism demanded cotton and not rice, right? And so the imposed monoculture that we see all across the global South today was happening in the US South because that's the sort of commodity that's required. In other words, we're talking about the distinction which needs to be incredibly important for us as organizers between exchange value, which is value for the market, and use value, which is value for us or value for what communities need, right? And we raise this a bit around this question of what other trajectories does the general strike point toward, right? Black workers had a crucial position within the pre-war economy because they were growing cotton, because it was so valuable, because they were also growing crops, right? Which is also true. It's, it's a bit more contradictory than that. And so by walking off, their withdrawal of that exchange value was incredibly debilitating to the Southern economy, but that didn't make them necessarily an only valuable workers for the union in terms of producing the very same crop, right? This is another way of saying that, again, and this is something that plays out in Haiti as well, enslaved people were fighting against not only slavery, but they were fighting against the plantation system. They did not want to go back and work on the same exact plantations with the same structure, right? You're already beginning to slide into this question of what use value would look like, growing what your community needs, building community outside of the United States as a framework, building community outside of capitalism as an economic system. And that's a different question, I think. And so when you're talking about Gullah communities, right, which again coincides heavily, I'm not an expert on this, but pretty heavily with like the Port Royal kind of, experimental lands that were redistributed during the course of the war. You're talking about communities that then, beginning as early as 1861, very early, were able to set themselves to community production for themselves, right? And that is something that leads to interesting dynamics because people were fighting to not have that be taken away, right? As it ultimately was, in most cases. So yeah, it's the clash of two different systems in more senses. What capitalism and the plantation owners wanted fundamentally was cotton, was that one crop. But that's in part because it's a crop that is not good for the community, or not necessary, not required.
Thanks for this week's lecture. My question regards what you make of Du Bois's strategy of what I would call concept construction. When we look at the chapter titles, they really do a lot of work there. These rich, concentrated terms that seem to be delineating an advanced notion of certain concepts. And I also want to relate this to what you were talking about in terms of inductive versus deductive methodology. So I'm just wondering what you make of this strategy that he seems to repeatedly engage in, where he takes a term that was maybe ostensibly universal, or in traditional Marxism, universal, such as proletariat or worker, and he retains the term, he holds on to it, and just puts black in front of it. I'm wondering that is a critique of the original term,
Yes.
right? In that it clearly exposes that it originally was not universal, or perhaps it was, if universality itself is one of these terms also, which is black exclusive. So I'm wondering if just the strategy of concept construction, where you put black in front of a term that you want to improve upon, retains too much of the metaphysical baggage of the old term. And I think it's also interesting to bear in mind the way this chapter began, with the quote from the anti-black academic about black people never raising passions above rationality. I'm reminded of Redman's song, I'll Be That. What if we want to say, well, rationality is this Enlightenment constructed term, right? That meant individuation and achieving one's interest in some kind of anti-black way, right? So I'm just wondering if he's holding on to these older terms of order with this strategy of concept construction, and if we could think about breaking out into new terms possibly at some point.
It's a great question. It's a very heavily debated question, right? Not around Du Bois, but just in general. Like, what it's the question of humanism. It's the question of universalism. Is like, if Black people and other categories are systematically excluded from humanity, why do we should we be saying no, we're all human, we're all worthy of access to and inclusion? Is that a claim for inclusion? Is it something different? And a lot of this for me really comes to that universal is like the category of categories when it comes to these pieces, right? So for me, like this argument, though, if you're decolonizing concepts, for example, universal is like the primary one, because it's the concept of concepts in these kinds of ways, right? Which is to say, embracing everything by being the category that describes embracing everything, if that makes sense. That was maybe too abstract, but it becomes much more concrete in the sense that I think Du Bois, the way Du Bois is located in these debates is as someone who embraces what I would call a kind of very dynamic and very dialectical view. Again, you see this, I think, throughout the text. You see it in the way that he puts every concept into motion, right? He allows it to be impacted by others, right? They're bouncing off each other's like kind of, each other like kind of pinballs, and they're being transformed, they're being set into motion, right? So when he says the general strike, on the one hand, he's critiquing the category of the general strike, and on the other hand, he's saying this is the general strike, and it's more general than the other general strike for this or that reason, right? So it is a recrafting. It's a claim for more legitimacy in a similar way, like I said today, when he says, or when he frames the Black proletariat as the universal class that does not fight for its own interests. He's saying something very, very real, right? Which is that in this context, they were the ones who had nothing to lose but their chains, right? This is a more accurate use of that category than to say the white worker in New York was the one that had nothing to lose but their chains, right? So he is kind of making a claim, which is not a claim, I don't think, for inclusion, right? It's a claim for the radical transformation and stretching of these categories. And the reason that it has to be radically transformative is that once you do that, the framework explodes a little bit, right? Explodes a little bit. It's kind of a funny phrase, because nothing really explodes a little bit. But I meant to say it doesn't like destroy Marxism as a framework, but the historical vision of the trajectory of different modes of production and the way that they interact with each other, or the idea that capitalism is determined by the opposition between industrial proletariat and bourgeoisie, and those are the main forces, right? Like that doesn't really hold the same traction. And it also destroys the sort of linearity and determinism of that framework, because instead of those two forces pushing against each other in a dynamic way, where you can kind of see or predict what the outcome might look like, you've got 12 different forces, right? You've got all these different interests, and they're not only material, but they're also ideological, right? So it's a dramatic complication of those forces. Now, I think this puts Du Bois in the trajectory of, again, thinkers like Fanon, thinkers like Césaire, and this broadly what remains a humanist dialectical tradition, who are reclaiming the category of the human in an attempt to make it truly human, right? And in a certain way, reclaiming the category of the universal in an attempt to think about what it would look like to build a truly universal universal, right? And it's not that they're like conservative by virtue of clinging onto those. It's just that they see it as this permanent and constant process of struggle, and that's the only way it moves forward. Interestingly, Fanon does so in exactly the same thing you said, the same way you said about Redman, right? Which is to say, he says, he goes through, and this is fundamentally in Black Skin, White Masks, where at the core of the book, chapter 5, on the lived experience, of the Black person, you see this explosive encounter. And that's, for him, the beginning of a reformulation of his own understanding of what dialectics looks like beyond Hegel. But it begins from him being the most universal person, right? The most rational person, right? Like, this is who he wants to be. This is who he aspires to be. And that book is a process of him confronting the barriers that racism puts up, right? He says, okay, like, I'm rational. Let's talk about this. Let's argue about it. I will argue my way out of this. And he realizes that you can't argue your way out of white supremacy, right? You can't be more rational than it. It's systematic irrationality, right? And so ultimately what he comes to is this moment of explosive reaction, which is the I'll be that, right? Which he calls making myself known, right? Exploding, saying, it's an explosion where he's screaming at this child, right? Who's saying racist things. But the point is that he's saying, you know what, I threw myself into irrationality because it was my only way toward a greater rationality, right? But he does keep that, he does keep the frame, right? He maintains it as a dynamic. And I think that applies to Du Bois too, right? That was a very good question and such a complicated subject.
Another from the chat. How does the planters' successful overthrowing of Reconstruction comport with Du Bois's claim in Chapter 3 that the planter died as a class after the Civil War?
Yeah, I struggle with this. I mean, I think I have admitted that I struggle with it. I mean, I think you can view it in a couple of different ways. And at some point I need to dig into figuring out exactly what he meant. What he says is pretty clear, which is that the planter as a class that existed prior to the war died, and it was dismantled, it was sort of disintegrated and in large part replaced by other planters, right? That makes sense, right? Like you're saying, like the system itself falls apart. Some of the planters lose their lands. Others are bought up. Northern capitalists are coming down. They're buying up lands. Others are going bankrupt, presumably. Their lands are being absorbed into other planters' lands. And so it seems to make sense, right? And if you remember, he says that very counterintuitive thing about this is, and I still don't know what to make of this suggestion that Jim Crow and the period after Reconstruction was so violent in terms of lynching and other things because it was poor whites who had become rich, who were in power. And that just seems super weird, because the suggestion is that the sort of planter class previously was somehow more cultured and civilized, which again seems like a strange thing to say. Where that argument, so that seems to be possible and to track, but what doesn't track for me then is the idea that there's a kind of interest built into it, right? So, because he talks in these chapters a lot about how, like, the interest immediately after the war of the planters was to reestablish slavery by any other means, right? I'm like, so who is the class that is expressing that interest, right? If it's not, and I feel like it could be something that's very much in motion, but still coalescing around this interest around sort of ownership of the land and how to exploit labor. But it seems like he's playing a little sort of fast and loose with the concepts and the classes when he's talking about those planters. It may exist, but if it doesn't exist, someone should do this analysis, which is like, who are the 7%, that he's talking about that are really in power? Where do they go? He says, and the way that he determines the fact that they disappeared is that their names all changed, right? And there's probably a good accounting of exactly what happened and who became the new planters. But maybe the final answer is something as boring as, it doesn't matter who owns the land, right? Their interest is going to be to exploit as much labor as cheaply as possible to grow as much cotton as possible on that land. And that may be the sort of boring version of the answer. But either way, there's a new planter class that exists after the war. Absolutely. Are we good? Cool. We are good. Awesome. Thank you all so much for the questions. Thanks to everyone in the chat. This was a really great conversation. And I look forward to seeing you all next week for the many states that we are going to sort of compress into a very quick analysis of Reconstruction experiments. So thank you all. Yeah.